Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something absolutely fascinating, the dramatic political evolution of JD Vance. We're going to unpack the deep-rooted motivations that turned one of Donald Trump's most public, vocal critics into his vice president. It's an incredible journey of shifting perspectives, so let's jump right in and break down exactly how and why this transformation actually happened.
The ideological pivot here is just jarring, right? Back in 2016, Vance publicly called himself a never-Trump guy. In private, he was even wondering if Trump was a cynical figure, or literally America's Hitler. But jump to 2024, and he's up on stage calling him the best president of my lifetime, describing him as super smart, warm, and generous. To truly wrap our heads around this massive shift, we have to look past the everyday political rhetoric. We need to examine the profound psychological foundation that was built during his incredibly turbulent childhood.
Section 1. Chaos, Anchors, and the Marines. Vance's early life in rural Appalachia and working-class Ohio was defined by extreme instability.
You see, this instability was entirely generational. His grandparents married incredibly young. In fact, his grandmother was pregnant at just 13 years old. Then came the deep trauma of his mother's severe addiction struggles, where she shifted from prescription drugs to heroin. And all of this was happening alongside a revolving door of father figures. By the time Vance was 12, his biological father was just completely gone. But amidst all of this chaos, his fierce grandmother, his mama, served as his absolute anchor. Her brand of tough love eventually propelled him toward structured discipline. He enlisted in the Marine Corps, which ultimately paved his way to higher education at Yale Law School.
He vividly recalls a very specific feeling from that time. Post 9/11, roughly 70% of young Americans were willing to die for their country. It was this deep, incredibly powerful well of patriotism. But Vance argues that this profound public trust was ultimately exploited and completely drained by political and military elites. Pointing directly to the intelligence failures and the leadership decisions surrounding the Iraq War, he felt deeply personally lied to. And that sentiment, that really sparked his enduring distrust of the political establishment. Section 2. The Political Paradigm Shift. That deep feeling of being misled by established experts planted the foundational seeds for his ultimate pivot. Basically, Vance concluded that his 2016 assumption, this idea that American institutions were functioning normally, was just dead wrong. He began to see those institutions as sclerotic and fundamentally broken. Because of this, he started to embrace Trump not as some cynical politician, but as a disruptive weapon, a weapon completely necessary to shatter a failing system. He now highlights Trump's high IQ and what he calls a warm, hospitable nature that the media ignores. Now, on the flip side, critics view this shift very differently. They argue it was simply a calculated political maneuver to gain power in a rapidly changing Republican Party, rather than any genuine ideological awakening.
Section 3. Immigration, Identity, and Division. This profound skepticism toward elite management heavily informs his systemic view on domestic issues.
He asks a really provocative question here. What if division is the inevitable consequence of when the population changes too quickly? Rather than blaming individual migrants who are just seeking a better life, Vance views political division through a systems lens. He argues that rapid, unchecked demographic changes inherently create societal friction and instability, entirely regardless of who the people actually are.
To put it into perspective, he uses the analogy of a room. If you invite 10 friends over, and they each bring one stranger, you've got a fun party. But if they each bring 3 strangers, the whole character of the room changes instantly. Vance insists his frustration is directed squarely at political leadership that ignores the real-world consequences of rapid change. He argues that slow, deliberate integration, where communities share language and economic stability, is the only way to protect working-class towns. Opponents, however, counter that this systems lens glosses over the immediate economic benefits of immigration, and they warn that this kind of framing can inadvertently fuel xenophobic rhetoric.
Section 4. Foreign Policy and AI. Vance's preference for disruptive truths over elite consensus doesn't just stop at the border. It extends right into global conflicts. He frequently cites unconventional diplomatic successes to make his case. For instance, a term sheet for an Iran peace deal championed during the Trump administration. The plan? Reopen the Strait of Hormuz, submit to strict international nuclear disposal, and in exchange, allow Iran to reintegrate into the global economy.
Vance argues this proves that breaking traditional diplomatic rules and using economic leverage can actually neutralize existential threats. Though, again, foreign policy critics often argue that stepping outside traditional frameworks like this can alienate our allies and just increase regional volatility.
He applies this exact same pragmatic America-first calculation to traditional allies too, including Israel. Vance emphasizes that while our interests often align, the United States and Israel are fundamentally different countries. He firmly believes the U.S. must always act as the senior partner, making decisions based strictly on American interests, rather than just unconditional alignment.
Domestically, this pragmatic view of leverage shapes his warnings about artificial intelligence. Vance isn't necessarily just worried about mass unemployment. He worries AI will destroy pre-distribution. Now, pre-distribution is the idea that workers should have inherent bargaining power to get fair wages up front, rather than relying on government wealth redistribution after the fact. He warns that AI threatens to concentrate wealth so heavily at the top that it completely strips workers of this vital leverage, potentially creating a technologically dependent underclass that has to rely on government handouts just to survive.
Section 5. The realities of high office. So, becoming vice president is the ultimate test of this entire worldview. It brings massive systemic power, sure, but at a profound personal cost. Vance openly wrestles with the heavy toll public life has taken on his family. Speaking about his 9-year-old son, he actually describes the guilt of watching him struggle with the overwhelming influx of armed Secret Service agents and the abrupt loss of a normal, quiet childhood. He acknowledges he basically conscripted his family into a life they never asked for.
To navigate this immense pressure, Vance leans heavily on a recent return to faith, which he chronicles in his book Communion. He also relies on a deep self-awareness of those childhood scars we discussed earlier, specifically recognizing his past avoidant attachment style. He uses this awareness to actively build the stable family life he never had growing up, trying his best to balance the intense burden of the vice presidency by focusing on the unique opportunities it provides his kids.
Ultimately, Vance's journey from working-class chaos to the White House forces us to look at America's current political realignment and ask a really tough question. Will breaking down these traditional elite institutions actually rebuild the American social contract and restore public trust? Or is it simply going to lead us into uncharted systemic instability? It's a question that is absolutely going to define the next era of American politics. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.